Okay, the recording has started, and this is the April 27th, 2020 Crossplane community meeting. We are nearing the finish line for the 0.10 release. We are a little bit behind here while we're waiting on some big features and support for composition and further ohm support. So we pushed the release back a little bit, but I believe the thinking is that we will be ready to do the release on Wednesday, which is the 29th, I think. Is there any updates or any dissent from that expectation now?
No, in fact, I was suggesting Tuesday or Wednesday, but I am totally happy to take Wednesday as the day. If that's what you thought it was going to be, one more thing.
Cool. Yeah, I think midweek here is what we're shooting for there. Yeah, I think we updated the roadmap from Phil. Got that one in not too long ago. Is Phil on the call? I don't think Phil's here today. Okay. So here's all the 0.10 stuff. There has been a lot of work from the community for some pretty important stuff here. We've been kind of tracking these as we've been going along, so I don't think we need to go through every item in the list here. And there's some further agenda items later in this meeting in which we'll go over some of these important stuff here. So we'll just leave this as it is, I think, and we'll keep shooting for a Wednesday release. Does anybody want to give an update with risks or long polls or things that we are still concerned about for being included in the release?
I will say for the composition stuff, I don't think there's a risk of it not being included. The code has landed, but the code is quite low quality by Crossplane standards at the moment. It's very MVP, so there is a risk that it is not up to our usual standards and might be a bit buggy, but it is supposed to be an alpha preview release of composition, so we're going to get it as good as we can before Wednesday.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I mean, we don't need to go off into this topic, but I was just thinking about that yesterday, actually, one of the things that's interesting about like the API versioning format of, alpha, beta, stable, et cetera, is that it's not super granular in terms of what the quality level is, like how well it's tested, like what the expectations are. It's kind of more about, the API compatibility sort of is the focus that we're mostly having on it. So it's interesting that, you can have like two things that are like a V1 alpha one, and one may be like, very crashy, buggy, not really working. And the other one is gonna be like, oh yeah, it's actually pretty reasonable. You can say, kind of start working on this. It's more about the API compatibility. That was just random musings while I'm in quarantine.
Yeah, I was thinking about a similar topic. Again, don't need to go into any depth on it now, but one thing that so composition has been mostly Mavavik and myself working on it. One thing we have done to expedite it is merge PRs without tests and say that we're coming to fix up the test of the next PR, which is not usually something that I would feel comfortable doing. So sort of need a better strategy for that in future, maybe working in a branch until we've got everything good to go and merging into master all at once or something.
Yeah, we did that a little bit for the templating controller to first get it off the ground. It's an engine for that. And that made me uncomfortable as well. We opened an issue to track adding the tests to get them up to 80% code coverage. So then we followed on with the later pull requests. But yeah, it was a bit against the normal standards. And we can get into that later. Sorry, let's stay focused here. Sorry. So that's everything for 0.10. We expect to get that out midweek. We will keep everybody up to date on that. We'll do an announcement about when the release is ongoing. So expect that midweek. Okay, let's move to the community topics section. So Hashdan, we did not do a TBS episode last week, but we have a special episode and time at the end of this week, do we?
Yep, Matt Moore from Knative is going to be joining this Friday, and then we'll be back on our regular schedule starting next week. But we're going to do some similar stuff to what we did with OpenFast in terms of consuming managed services provisioned by Crossplane and serverless functions that are provisioned by Knative. So there'll be some cool stuff there, as well as some of the new composition and OAM stuff brings up some more topics about being able to stitch some of those things together a little bit better. So should be some really cool stuff. There's also some similar patterns that we share in terms of architecture and how we build controllers and that sort of thing. So we'll probably get into that, which will be of more general interest to the community, you know, of folks that are developing projects in the kind of cloud native Kubernetes space.
Just to put a quick follow on that's loosely related to that, Dan and I, as well as I think Ryan and some of the folks from Alibaba, met with people from Knative at VMware and Red Hat on Friday of last week to talk about bindings, which in this context was the binding of cloud services to application workloads, or basically ways to take something about CRX and inject it into CRY. For instance, maybe take the endpoint of a database from CRX and inject it into deployment Y. It was a really good conversation. No actions from it yet, but we did decide to make a Slack channel on Kubernetes Slack and meet every 2 weeks. So if anyone else is interested in that topic, feel free to, I guess, maybe ping me on Slack, ping Negs on Crossplane Slack, and I'll make sure that I link you the relevant details.
Was there any like was there already an established sense of commonality in the the implementations of those bindings, or is it kind of everyone had a similar problem, but they're all coming at it from different angles?
It seemed like there was quite a lot of commonality. OEM has a trait injector that worked similarly to OpenShift's service binding injector, and then Knative had something similar there. Crossplane was maybe the least developed in this way, because we sort of just give you a secret and say, good luck, here's a secret, go load your stuff from it, whereas they were all starting to think about how to actually automatically inject that into workloads. So, but to answer your question, Alibaba, Knative, and Red Hat all felt pretty similar in the approach they were taking there. Not identical, but close enough that I believe the OpenShift take on it is intended to be sort of a common standard. So it could be worth us looking into that as to whether we could just use their operator on top of Crossplane to do that for us.
And had any of those been surfaced as like KEPs in like upstream Kubernetes?
Not that I'm aware of. It seems like it's pretty early days.
Cool. All right. Yeah. So that's the bindings discussion there. So we mentioned this in the 0.10 update that a lot of the composition work was coming together. Nick, is there more updates for everyone on the call about like what the scenarios that are supported are, or what the expectation of things you can do with the 0.10 release in composition?
Yeah, I can try and keep it brief. There is a pull request open against Crossplane. It's one of the older pull requests at this point. I'll just quickly.
At 1163?
Thank you. Grabbing that link if I can. Jared, why must you lie to me? Nope, you're not lying. I just can't use URLs.
Yeah, I try not to lie to you, Nick. I have enough respect for you not to lie to you directly.
I left out the repo name. I just had the org name. So this pull request that I've just linked in chat. So the contemporary Crossplane model, as many of you may be aware, uses resource classes and resource claims to produce infrastructure resources in the same way that in many cases you'll use persistent volume claims is the closest thing in upstream Kubernetes. So in this context, the application user creates a claim, and that sort of represents the need of their app, and an infrastructure operator has created a class that describes basically a way to satisfy the app's need. And then we use those two to create a sort of actual managed resource. We found this to be limiting in a couple of ways. One, it is very hard to come up with just a common set of claims that work for everyone, especially if the claims are supposed to be portable across clouds and things like that. It's difficult to come up with a common set of fields that apply to every possible SQL database, for example, implementation. And the other thing is that often we want our sort of primitive managed resources, sort of the bits that you compose infrastructure from, to be sort of quite granular so that we don't hold too many opinions. For instance, when we give you an Azure database, we don't want to automatically give you a firewall rule as well. You may not want that. You probably want to actually pick explicitly what you want. But at the moment, we can only have one claim to one infrastructure API call, one managed resource. So the goal of this composition design is effectively to let you, some of the names are going to change, but it effectively lets you provide the schema for your own claims. So if our claims that you get out of the box don't work for you, you can say, I actually want the claim that asks for a MySQL to be called migrate company SQL and have fields X, Y, and Z. And then you could describe in YAML without leaving Kubernetes, using a CR, what should happen when Crossplane sees one of those claim type things. So basically you can say when my Acme Corp SQL gets created, then you should actually go and create an Azure SQL Server and an Azure Virtual Network rule and a resource group, or whatever you like with any cloud provider. So for 0.10, it'll be MVP alpha support. For instance, we're looking into eventually having it so that if you edit your Acme Corp claim type thing, those changes will be propagated to your managed resources that we provisioned. That probably won't be there in 0.10. It will just make them once and then move on with its life. But the bare minimum functionality will be there. So we're probably going to release it a little bit subtly. We probably won't make too much fanfare about it because we'd like another release to polish it off a little bit. But if anyone is interested, the functionality will definitely be there, and you're welcome to probably just reach out to myself or Mavavik to get some tips on how to use it if you really want to try it before we get the documentation ready.
Is there anything big, Nick, that's left on before this this design PR will be able to come out of draft or get merged?
There's nothing that big, to be honest. There's a little bit of a backlog there's a few areas where there are explicit to-dos there that, for instance, just filling out the background and sort of a little bit more detail on what I just said. Some things that are sketched out in YAML at the moment, for instance, this concept of transform functions that apply to basically take a value from a claim and mutate it before we use it to make a managed resource. There are examples in YAML that you can probably get a good idea of how it works, but there's no explicit paragraph explaining them. So I had hoped to be working on that this sprint, but we ended up prioritizing the actual draft implementation. So the design is probably going to be, it's been approved by Bassam. It's probably going to be actually wrapped up and merged after this MVP is landed.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, it's really good to see that stuff come together. Okay, and then I was also hoping to get a quick update on all of the Ohm support. I know there's been a ton of work in that area as well. And I know some of the Alibaba folks are on the call as well, and Microsoft as well. Is there anyone who can provide the entire community on the call here with an update for Ohm support in Crossplane?
Yeah, I'm happy to provide an update, and then anyone else who's been working on it can follow on with their thoughts as well. So one of the big updates is the new Ohm Kubernetes Runtime repo, which basically contains some common reconcilers as well as the actual application configuration controller. So basically these are now consumed by Crossplane, as well as the OAM add-ons right now. So that allows us to kind of like move on the Ohm support a little bit separate from the lifecycle of Crossplane and the add-ons. So that's been a nice improvement, and there's been lots of folks working on that. And then in terms of the integration with Crossplane, the service tracker app, which Microsoft, I think, wrote a majority of, it's over in the samples repo in the OAM dev org. Has been refactored to be able to run on Crossplane with the Ohm support now. So you can basically spin up a either managed Postgres database on one of the cloud providers like Azure, Alibaba, GCP, etc., or you can run the Postgres database in cluster, which is the previous configuration. So we'll have some cool demos coming with that. And then there's also some tangential work for kind of like packaging up with composition some of the resources that'll be consumed by that. So for instance, in Azure, to provision a database and consume it, you have to set up a VNet rule, which Nick already spoke about, was kind of blocked by this one-to-one claim class resource relationship. So now we can provision that alongside a database, which allows us to kind of like consume all of that in one fell swoop. So lots of improvements there. And yeah, I think we'll have some cool demos and examples coming out for that.
Sorry.
Hello. So we had like last week we tried the demo and we saw some issues setting up locally. Also Crossplane. Are those issues fixed?
Yeah. So basically last week we had there was a PR merge that added composition stuff that basically didn't have the right permissions added, which we fixed right after. So that's what was happening when we were running it locally. The Crossplane pod was essentially trying to list types that it wasn't able to. So that's a pretty simple fix. As far as the VNet rule stuff, that is still manual right now in terms of like the walkthrough, but it is now supported by composition. So I can circle back with you on that, Archer.
Okay, thank you though. Thanks.
Yeah, hypothetically from Azure side of things, to take Crossplane, spin up an Azure AKS cluster and an Azure PostgreSQL server, and then deploy Flight Tracker to it. I believe we have all of the code in place to do that. We just need to actually test it end to end again and validate that. And as I say, some of the code needs work, but it's functional at the moment. I think.
Yeah, that's what the exercise we're doing last week. So we're gonna do it again this week. Thank you.
Yeah. I think we would like to do that with Alibaba Cloud at the moment. We have, I believe, support for RDS in Alibaba Cloud. It seems like we probably won't get support for ACK at the moment, would be my guess. I'm not sure if Hong Chao's on the call there, but he's working on those two. So that means we might be able to demo a local variant of this, where instead of deploying the Flight Tracker app to a Kubernetes cluster that's managed by Crossplane, we might just be able to demo installing the Flight Tracker app to the cluster where Crossplane is running, but using an Alibaba database, hopefully.
Don't forget about all the other important services that the service tracker adds, like earthquakes and weather too. It's not all about flights. Archer, did you write the service tracker app originally?
No, I just made a change to support PostgreSQL.
Okay, got it. All right, thank you for the updates on Ohm support in Crossplane. Okay, if there aren't any other community topics here that weren't in the agenda, then we can move on ahead to the PRs section.
Can I volunteer Casey to give an update on some of the stuff that he's been working on? Casey, do you feel okay with that?
Yeah, I put it further into the agenda, but I can go. Yeah, so this is just a quick update to let everybody know that we're working on a project to use code generation to get rid of some of the toil involved in building a controller. There's a link to the issue under the optional time for deeper technical discussions section there. Yeah, 1426. That is going to be updated in the next couple of days with a design doc. And this document is going to be more just kind of high level explaining what our goal is and the general approach, which is essentially we're going to be looking at different sources for provider API descriptions, whether those be SDKs or open API documents, kind of scraping those into an intermediate format that describes the types and methods of these APIs, and then writing a code generation tool to go from that format to all the kind of boilerplate that you see when you look at a Crossplane controller. So that's it in a nutshell. I just want to make everybody aware of this issue so that if people have ideas or I just noticed I have 3 Ps in approach there. So anything you want to contribute to this, comments or questions, let me know, and keep an eye on this issue, and you'll see a doc coming soon. That's it.
Awesome, Casey. Thanks for that update. I think that's super useful work too, to be able to, broaden the scope of supported services that, Crossplane can deploy and provision and manage and such. That effort towards that is going to be really useful. All right, let's take a look at some of these PRs here. Dan, do you want to mention this one here? I took a full pass to this morning at least, and provided limited, like, because it looks good. I didn't have too much feedback to provide. But is there more you wanted to bring up on this one?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to mention kind of what's happening here because I think it's a decently significant change.
Yeah, the impact.
Yes, and so it's actually been updated now with the manual testing as well. So essentially what we're doing is when you install a stack in Crossplane, whether it's namespace or cluster scope, there's eventually going to be a deployment that comes out of that with a controller or multiple controllers that are watching the resources that are installed and taking action, et cetera. So mostly you think of providers or stacks or apps or something like that. So when those are installed right now, for providers, you basically package up an install.yaml, which is kind of like a template for a deployment. And the stack manager takes that and then does some modifications, mostly around like naming and maybe some things passed in on the stack install or cluster stack install. And then that gets created in the cluster running against the API server. So the issue with that is that you could pretty much potentially do anything you wanted in that install.yaml. So if there was a malicious provider or something like that, it could get some pretty severe access to your cluster and get like root access on your nodes and that sort of thing. So we obviously don't want to do that. And it's kind of a security concern. So what we're doing here is by default, the stack manager will now run by wiping the security context of the stack deployment. And it will set a variety of fields that are described in this PR to basically allow these deployments to never run as root. There's a couple of kind of intricacies around that, including that a lot of containers by default run as root. So for instance, a lot of our providers, we don't explicitly set the user to be running in that. So they will try to run as root. So if you set the security context to run as non-root, then the container is just going to fail to, and you'll get a create config error and it won't run, which, you know, maybe that's fine because we don't want them to run as root, but we'd prefer that if someone did not configure their container to run as non-root, that it could still run if it didn't need that root access. So essentially we set it to user 100. And if at that point it's not able to execute its normal functionality because it needs root access, then it will experience issues there. But this has now been tested, and we really shouldn't see situations where we'd need root access in things we're installing into Crossplane. But if you did want to, you could always pass this insecure pass full deployment flag here, which will allow you to kind of provide arbitrary deployments. There's kind of some more design that we may want to do around this, but this is kind of a short-term security enhancement, I guess. So I think it'll be good for the short term. The primary area where there was concern around this was in the hosted Crossplane scenario. We had to pass in some information to be able to connect to the tenant API server. So I tested that out this morning and provided some documentation here, and then also updated your design doc on security isolation, Jared, with changes here. So I think it'll be a good improvement and in general improve our security posture a little bit.
Were any of the existing like provider controllers, did they have to get updated to be able to run as non-root themselves, or but like they untouched?
So that's one of the reasons why I added the run as user part of the security context, because I installed provider GCP and we don't explicitly set the user in there, so it's just running as root by default. But once we set the user to 1000, then it's going to still execute successfully. It doesn't need root access. It's just the container is just doing it as default. So we could update them. Might be a best practice to make them not running as root by default, but it won't break anything in Crossplane for them to stay as they are.
Okay, got it. Cool. Yeah, thanks for getting that in there. And then that brings up some other questions about how we advertise the changes, like in policies and stuff like that, because it's a bit of a security policy update. It's something that would be good to include in like the 0.10 blog post, and get a little bit more awareness around it.
Yeah, and that issue that you showed that this PR references, that I believe you wrote up, has some kind of like more ideas in it, / it's a little more general. So I doubt this will be the only modification made here, but it does address kind of those immediate concerns.
Yep. Cool. Okay, Nick, you have another item here for provider AWS pull requests.
Yeah, I know Hershey and his team have been working on a ton of pull requests over there, some of which we have already got in for 0.10. So thank you for that. We now have DynamoDB table support in Crossplane. And we also added, what was the other one? Cache subnet groups, which were awkwardly missing from our AWS Elasticache support. So it's now way easier to plumb everything together in Elasticache. And there's still a couple of other ones open there. So I just wanted to check in with Hershey and his team about which of these we should try and prioritize to get merged by Wednesday, because I know that some of them are close to done. And I think I will say that I know that S3 bucket and cache cluster are probably, in my judgment, not necessary to get in for 0.10. But any other PR in this list is up for grabs for us to finish.
Yeah, I think, so I'll let Sahil go on this, but I feel the IAM ones, so these 3 PRs are essentially the high fidelity implementation of IAM, getting the policy, the user, and the attachment together. That one and the network resources is something that I think we should be able to. But Sahil, if you differ on that, you can comment on this.
Hey, yeah, so the 3 IAM PRs, I think they are good to go. And the network PR, it needs a revisit from master and the new referential pattern, which I'm actually working on. So yeah, that should be ready to go till our release on Wednesday.
Awesome, cool. I will look at the IAM PRs after this meeting then and make sure that they're ready to go.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Awesome, good. Yeah, it's awesome to get those also included in 0.10.
Cool.
Okay, and then hashed in discussion here in the Ohm Kubernetes runtime repo.
Yeah, I just added this in case folks want to talk about this. It may not be, it doesn't look like we have too many OAM folks on the call, but this is kind of related to some of the binding stuff we were mentioning earlier. And the idea is that in Ohm you have workloads and traits basically modify workloads. And there may be Kubernetes resource types from other projects and that sort of thing that want to serve as traits. And if we have a strict enforcement of having this workload reference field, that we're not going to be able to essentially bring arbitrary Kubernetes resource types and allow them to serve as traits. So there is some ideas around this being floated here, but I just wanted to bring it to people's attention. It looks like Hong Chao actually just now added this comment. But one of the ideas here is using labels. There's also an existing small project, the trait injector, that's mentioned there, which basically introduces a different object for doing the binding of resources. So this is just something to keep in mind. I wanted to surface in case any folks were wanting to mention anything about it.
Yeah, so we talked about that, did have some discussion internally about this. So we definitely would like to open OAM for anyone to bring their operators. So that means we would not like our CRD definition to be restricted. That's kind of just a high level idea. And another thing is we need to find a way for any trait to know how to apply to the workload. So there are actually 3 things there. First thing is for a trait, in the trait, how does it know which workload it is modifying? So currently we are using the workload ref, but we think it will will violate like the rule number one, that we will require some restrictive CRDs. The second thing the trait controller needs to know is what sub-resources, Kubernetes resources, either CRD or native ones, it is modifying. That part is also missing. Even with the workload ref, right? You see the workload, but you don't really know what it is really modifying. So we have a proposal. Actually, I'm going to write a proposal. The high-level idea is we think it's a good place to register that in the workload definition. Currently, the workload definition is pretty much a shim. There's nothing there. We feel like it's a good place to put the registration there. The registration will have information about the workload. Basically, when you have say you have a workload CRD and operator, when you want to bring it into the OM, currently you do a registration, which is put a workload definition around it, which I said literally is nothing other than just have a workload definition and pointing to the CRD. So we are thinking of in that workload definition, you can say what are the resources you generate, so that when a trait comes, there's a second way. So that solves the second problem. And the third problem is, how do you get to that information from the trait point of view? So from the trait point of view, with whatever information you put here, you can find a workload CR, but you don't have workload definition CRD. That part is missing in the OM current OM definition. I think I proposed something before, and Nick thinks we can just use name. So basically, when you have the trait CR, you find a workload CR, and by convention, you find the workload CR definition CRDs, and then find out what are the sub-resources in that workload CR. And then you find out then you get to the get. I see the dense kind of generic trait reconciler. Does something similar, that it basically assume that the name of the name is the same, and it's a deployment, you just find it. Actually, it's not deployment. In that CR, you say, give me the sub resource type. I assume it's name, right? You can just find it, and then I'll modify it. We go a little bit step further, that the sub resource name, a list of sub resource names and GVKs are registered in the workload definition, and we find it and then do the rest. That's our I don't know if I made it clear. It's a little bit complicated. I will definitely write a issue for that, design doc for that, but I don't know if you get my high level idea.
I think if I follow correctly, you were saying that in the workload definition resource that we have today, that, as you say, kind of just points to the CRD. Another thing that could do is basically explicitly declare that this workload is going to make these child resources when it's rendered out.
Exactly. A list of child resources, actually. It may, remember, in dense CI says, if it has multiple ones, it may have problems. So we will allow them to list multiple child resources. And another detail is, we will leave the name out, because I think it's hard to know the exact name. Sometimes the names are auto-generated. So we are just going to list all the things that is with this GVK, and use the owner reference to identify if it is a sub-resource of that workload CR.
Yeah, that seems like a good start. I have some questions about how it might work in maybe edge cases that may go away eventually, but like at the moment, for instance, we have the local and remote things that actually create different types. So the same workload, containerized workload, will either create services and deployments, or will create a Kubernetes application. I guess you could just have different workload definitions. So
yeah. You do both. And in one case, you will not find one. You list everything, you don't find it, then that's okay. You list another thing, you find one that you do something on that.
Yeah, this general, sorry, and please, if you talk to Harry, apologize to him, because he was chasing me this weekend and I didn't get a chance to reply. I like the goal here of not having to have an explicit ref. I have some questions. I'm not sure personally. Using labels feels a little weird. I'm not sure if annotations would be better, just because it's keeping structural data, but it's kind of splitting hairs. It could be that using a separate.
Yeah, we had discussion too. So for us, the only difference between annotation and the label is sometimes label is more natural to do label selection.
Mhm.
We are not sure if there's any reason to have select there. If not, then I think we can also do annotations.
Yeah, it's definitely labeled there. There's a lot more machinery for filtering on that, but that's when I was talking about the one-to-many thing in my comment a few days ago. My main thinking was labels usually mean, hey, there'll be many of these things. It kind of has that implication. So annotations, we have a couple of places in Crossplane where we use annotations, and we often will just get everything. You know, if we know the type that's annotated is a type foo, we'll get all the foos and then filter server side to find one out, which is okay as long as there's not like hundreds of CRs of that kind.
Oh, so just let me see if I understand. So you want to do the select, but you still put in annotation, and instead of like O1 search, it becomes like basically O1 search and just go through.
Yeah, so most of the times that we've done that in Crossplane, we're quite confident that we're searching across a very small amount of CRs. It's unlikely that there'll be more than 10, for instance. We've just done that mostly to stick to it's somewhere in the Kubernetes docs, I can maybe find a link later, they have a thing that explains the intention of labels versus the intention of annotations that are subtly different sort of thing. So often, for instance, if we have a case where resource classes, we want to mark one as the default, it felt more in line with Kubernetes opinions to use an annotation for that, even though it would be better programmatically to use a label, because then we could just say, give us the one that has this label, instead of having to say, give us all of them, and then we find the one that has the label. But
okay, yeah, I think the high level idea is really putting that, is not enforcing the CRD and put the registry kind of into the workload definition. The rest are kind of less important. We can right away. Yeah.
I am also kind of curious about the general idea I like of, we've already said that workloads are things that you can bring to OAM. Sometimes workloads will be designed for OAM. The CR will be an OAM specific thing. Sometimes they're, in the example that Leigh's put here, there's the etcd cluster from I'm guessing the etcd operator. And then and so that would work today as a workload, but then he's illustrating potentially you could use an etcd backup as a trait of that workload. One interesting thing is presumably in most cases where that would work with existing CRs, there's already a reference between them. I would imagine that, the etcd backup needs to know what etcd cluster it's backing up, and it kind of looks like it might just take endpoints here. But I'd be curious to look at a few other potential cases here and see if they don't already just have a reference between them to make it work in the first place.
Yeah, that's another thing. I think the whole OAM, this finding, jumping basically multiple jumps to find the resources only if, as you said, the trait doesn't know what the workload is working. This is for the case, say, a very simple case, a manual trait. Actually, if this works, I'm going to change the way the manual trait works. Is it just want to apply to anything, a lot of things. Some traits are really specifically designed for one type of workload, then this mechanism doesn't apply here. It's an optional thing. You don't have, not every trait has to follow this. It just gives you a way to do a generic way to, because eventually another goal for this OAM is we want, as we mentioned before, we didn't put a policy there yet, is to allow a trait to apply to multiple or a class of workloads instead of, some traits are really one-on-one, but some traits, rollout traits, or some traits you want to do this can apply to, it's kind of like inheritance or something. You can apply to something that you don't even know, like the workload doesn't exist yet, but as long when the new workload comes in, you don't have to change your trait to fit to that. That's another goal. But for the other case that you mentioned, the trait is clearly applied to certain workload, then that doesn't apply.
Yeah, for the one-to-many, it might be interesting to look for overlaps. We're getting kind of into the weeds now, but with the stuff that we spoke about, the service binding guys the other day, where like Knative has their duck types, where they sort of say, if this CR has these fields, we consider that to be a type it can apply to. I think either way, I like the idea of adding metadata to the workload definition to say this workload will create these types, even if it's only for informational purposes for humans to go read and be like, oh, this will make these types so I can see what's going to happen when I render this.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, I'll write up this after this meeting.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks for weighing in on there. So that was the last issue we had in the PR section. And then I think we had already addressed this issue here that Casey had wanted for code generation. So I think that was everything that was on the agenda items. Was there anything else that this group here wants to bring up for discussion before we adjourn?
None from me.
Alrighty, then I think we could go ahead and. Oh,
I have a question actually.
yes,
Regarding
Ryan.
another PR is about the there's some discussions about CI/CD and the test. When I was doing when I was doing the example PRs on the Crossplane, that's OM Kubernetes runtime. So any thoughts on that? I'll give you some background. The background is I'm not familiar with Crossplane current CI, how CI works, but I kind of had a crash course on how to set up GitHub action. And also the test, I'm using Ginkgo, whatever it's called, which is sort of, seems like a prevalent one. So I'm using that on the OM Kubernetes runtime. And Nick has some thoughts on that, and Dan also have some inputs on that. I just want to bring it up to see what's the community's take on that.
I could address the Ginkgo thing first, because that's something that we have a stronger opinion on than the other stuff, I think. Ginkgo is a bit of an interesting one because Kube Builder has opinions about tests, and they happen to scaffold out Ginkgo-based tests. Go as a language does not like that approach, and I tend to personally agree with Go. So Crossplane today has no Ginkgo tests. I think we originally had some, and then we just said no, we'll just use the standard library for testing. And there's a Google tool called CMP for comparison. We basically just use testing.t and CMP, and it sort of does the trick. I would prefer to keep to the established convention and not reintroduce Ginkgo tests. I can send through, it is subjective, it is kind of a personal thing. I can send through some of the rationale that the Go project includes as to why you shouldn't use things like that. But yeah, my preference would be to be subjective here. I think there's an interesting thing that we're not subjective. Sorry, my preference would be to be consistent here. I think there's an interesting thing that we're facing as we end up with more and more Crossplane repos. We're eventually going to hit an inflection point where we just say like, okay, this repo is run by that team, and that team can just pick however they want to write tests and things like that. But while we have a relatively small group of us all working across several repos, I think there's value in following the conventions. And when we want to change potentially, you know, if we really love like Ginkgo or a new testing library, I would love us to sort of be like, hey, let's change testing libraries like as a conscious decision across all repos sort of thing. We'll like agree that we're going to do this everywhere and then start moving in that direction.
Yeah, one of the things that I mentioned on that PR specifically was, so this PR is adding integration tests, which is something that we're pretty light on right now. So I know I mentioned on there, Ryan, that I've been working on some table-based integration tests, basically. So I will be adding some of those for you to take a look at, and then we can kind of look at that. So I owe you a PR on that repo.
Sounds good.
Yeah, for some background context here, there was an interesting PR on KubeBuilder some months ago where, forgetting the dude's name, but one of the Kubernetes engineers at Google opened up a pull request and was like, let's change to how Go likes to write code. And then the KubeBuilder maintainer was like, no, this is how we like to write unit tests. And then there was a big debate about what the right way to write unit tests is. And, but this thing that I just put in the chat is what the Go project feels about. Oh, sorry, they have a separate one for testing. But anyway, yeah, I'll send that through later. As to the GitHub Actions and how we actually run CI/CD, I'm intrigued. I kind of think that GitHub Actions makes sense personally. We currently and historically have run Jenkins CI/CD, but the Jenkins instances are sort of owned and operated by Upbound, and I'm not sure if we have any, Jared can speak to this, but potentially I'm not sure if we have any process to give people who aren't Upbound employees access to the CI/CD system to update it, things like that.
Yeah, that's something that we definitely can do because, you know, we've had a fairly pragmatic approach to productivity of if, somebody needs access to improve or to maintain the CI/CD pipelines, then, as a Crossplane community member, then that's something that I don't have a problem with giving access to.
Yeah, I know that there has been some stuff. I'm not sure how much we've talked about this in community meetings, but I know that, we've talked about potentially as part of opening up a little bit more, moving those Jenkins instances so that they're not in the upbound.io domain and things like that, so that they feel like more part of the community. But I think sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there was a discussion about that. That's what I said.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things here. Like we also use a Git submodule that's under the Upbound GitHub org that is also used by Upbound internal engineering projects. I think I think at some point, maybe after the 0.10 release, basically, it might behoove us to sit down and think about whether we can make our CI/CD system a little bit more community friendly than it is at the moment.
Okay.
And I personally, if we're not strongly tied to Jenkins as the thing that actually invokes the build submodule, then I don't see why we wouldn't consider moving to GitHub. That gives you some quite nice YAML sort of based sort of equivalents to the Jenkins file. Basically, I started experimenting with GitHub Actions as a way to run our linter this week as well. So long story short, no decisions, but I think we should look into it.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think would be most interesting there is that we cross compile, so we do ARM and AMD64 builds, and I don't know really anything about GitHub Actions, but that would be an immediate thing to check out. With GitHub Actions, can you end up doing cross compilations and have for multiple architectures and stuff like that?
Yes, you do. You have that in GitHub Actions, and you also have Linux support, Windows support, and Mac OS support as well. So GitHub gives you that GitHub Actions. So we have been using that on a separate open source project called Dapper, and we use that for unit testing, building, releasing, and also for E3 tests. So GitHub Actions has been proved pretty solid for us here.
Yeah, I think it could be nice as well to maybe get a few of us to get together and maybe like, it doesn't need a full design doc or anything, but like sketch out a direction that proposes what we'd like to do with CI/CD. That way, folks like Jared and Bassam, who have deep experience with the current CI/CD system, can call out edge cases like that and just make sure that we're ticking all the boxes.
Yeah, the overall idea, I mean, I agree with all these, just because we want to, at least from the OM standpoint, we want to attract as many outsider community contributors as much as possible. And so anything that is standard, community standard, feels like it will be helpful in that way. It's just the background for that.
Yeah, I think that, Jenkins versus GitHub is, Jenkins is the 500-pound gorilla here. Many people have worked with Jenkins before, so it's not, no one really likes Jenkins in my experience, but I assume plenty of people know it. One thing that's nice about GitHub, as we discovered when Ryan was adding those CI things, is that you don't have to separately grant access to Jenkins. Basically, if someone's a maintainer of the GitHub repo, they have the ability to figure CI/CD, which is kind of nice. It just feels more tightly integrated with the existing sort of community experience that GitHub gives you.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I like that like permissions and access integration type of thing. That's cool too. Cool. Yeah, it'd be good to learn more about that and discuss if it makes sense. I don't think in general, I don't think that as a Crossplane community we're staunchly against change just because we don't like change. But if it makes sense to open up things more broadly to attract new contributors, and it also makes sense from like a cost benefit perspective as well, like redoing and rewriting all of our CI/CD infrastructure and pipelines and stuff like that has a cost, so we'll have to weigh that in as well. But we're definitely open to making community members' lives more like better and also making it more attractive for the project to come to. So that's all good.
Cool. Sounds good.
Cool. Okay, and then any other topics? Alrighty then. Okay, thanks everybody for joining today, and we can go ahead and adjourn.
Thanks, guys.
Take care, everybody.